I'm Sam Medina, and this is the Rift Online Church, building God's kingdom in you. Tonight we're going to be continuing our series on the book of Judges, and we're going straight into it in Judges chapter 15, and we can call this Useful Idiots Part 2, because we're still talking about Samson. Last week we called Samson a useful idiot, and I know that seems harsh, but when we really evaluate the life of Samson, God had to use him in spite of how stupid he was being. And in fact, I was talking to my wife earlier today about something in the previous chapter where his parents say to him, "Why don't you ever find like one of the women of our people?" And what that seems to imply was that was not the first wife he had them get for him, and which is really bad. Seems he was always going after these foreign women, and so there appears to be a pattern of bad judgment on Samson's part, which leads to all these other problems. And every problem Samson has centers around his bad judgment when it comes to women, and his pride and his temper and everything else. But the more prominent parts of the story involve his love life. And so let's get right into it. In Judges chapter 15, it says, "But it came to pass," starting at the first verse, "within a while after, in the time of the wheat harvest, that Samson visited his wife with a kid. And he said, I will go into my wife into the chamber. But her father would not suffer him to go in. And her father said, I truly thought you had utterly hated her. Therefore I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister fairer than she? Take her, I pray thee, instead of her." We got some drama going on. Samson leaves, and apparently he's been gone for a while. In fact, it was long enough that now it's time to harvest the wheat. So apparently at least a couple months have gone by. This is not good. It's not exactly the exemplary husband. Leaves his wife all by herself. Doesn't even take her home with him. He leaves her there with her parents, and comes back and wonders, her father gave her away to somebody else. Which wasn't, we can say that wasn't right, and it wasn't, but it's ultimately Samson's fault. Samson's been irresponsible. And so Samson, in the third verse, it says, "And Samson said concerning them, Now I shall be more blameless than the Philistines, though I do them a displeasure." Now, Samson's mad. And like I said last week, if Samson didn't get mad, he'd never do anything. He had all this power, all this strength. He does these great feats of strength that he should have been using to deliver Israel, but he doesn't get around to doing anything until somebody ticks him off. And very, very much along those lines, a lot of us, similarly, we don't do anything until God backs us into a corner, until there's drama, until there's conflict, until we are really between a rock and a hard place. We don't move, we don't pray, we don't fast, we don't deal with issues until we really have to. And Samson doesn't even deal with the issues. That's even worse. All he does is just basically vent his anger. And don't get me wrong, he's got pretty good reason for being angry, even though he was being an idiot. The guy really shouldn't have gave his wife away. And so it says in the fourth verse, Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took firebrands and turned tail to tail and put a firebrand in the midst between two tails. Now, people usually look at this as a great feat because he caught 300 foxes, and that is impressive to catch 300 foxes. We're not told how he did this. We don't know if he ran around and just grabbed them or set traps or whatever, but 300 foxes, that is impressive. But we focus on that. We don't focus on the fact that what he did was cruel to the foxes. Remember that in Proverbs it says that the righteous regards the life of his beast, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. Samson had no regard for the life of these foxes. And sure, people trap foxes all the time and use the pelts, and they skin them and all that. But I want you to understand, at least when people trap them, they kill them quick. People go hunting, they shoot them, and it's over. But here, he's tying their tails together with a firebrand, sets it on fire, and lets them scramble around. That's pretty cruel. And there are people who will do cruel things because and we see this in the church today. We see people. I remember one time my little sister had this famous prophet was ministering at her church, and walked up to my sister, and she had said some things to her. One of the things she said to her was that the Lord was saying, unlike the church, I'm not mean. I'm not mean like the church. That's a horrible prophecy to have to hear, that the church is mean. And it's the truth. A lot of times we got all this drama going on where people are just being mean and nasty. You can speak in tongues, but you're not sanctified in your temperament. People say, I got the Holy Ghost, but does the Holy Ghost have you? And the truth is, for most of us, that's not the case. We got a gift and we think it means that we've arrived. And if you can be cruel, then you haven't arrived. And you see this kind of cruelty. And I've seen, well, more like heard of. I probably saw it, but I was too young to remember. My mother would tell me about my uncle, who would actually get his cat drunk and tie firecrackers to the cat's tail and set him off. And he thought that was funny. They all thought it was funny. I was horrified by it because that's really cruel. My mother thought it was funny. And so many other people in the family thought it was funny. Christian people, Pentecostal, tongue speaking, they thought this stuff was funny. It's like, you're being cruel to this poor little animal. And it's like it says in the Psalms, the dark places of the earth are filled with the habitation of cruelty. Whatever darkness you got in you has capacity for cruelty. And I don't want to digress here, but this is an important thing because so many of us have this capacity for cruelty that we engage in regularly, and we think that's okay with God. Because we like to talk about grace, 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 and we never talk about the fear of God. And the truth is, the reason for it, the reason why we can be cruel, the reason why we can be mean, the reason why we can be nasty, the reason why we don't do what we're supposed to do is because most of us don't fear God. And I know the modern church likes to turn the phrase the fear of God into just respect or reverential awe. But there was a reason Paul said to work out your salvation with fear and with trembling. People don't fear God. And that's part of Samson's problem too, because Samson did whatever he wanted. And what he did was cruel. And it says, when he set the brands on fire, he let them go into the standing corn of the Philistines and burnt up both the shocks and also the standing corn with the vineyards and the olives. Now he just did some damage. Because unless you graft in some live olive branches to a younger tree, it takes a very long time for an olive tree to get mature to the point where it can produce olives. So if you burned up everything, they're either going to have to go far afield and go somewhere else to buy some new olive trees, or they are just out of luck when it comes to olives. You may think that's not a big deal, but olives are very valuable. The oil was valuable. It was a commodity. It's still a commodity. The olive oil you buy in the store, most of the time it's really hazelnut oil. And they flavor it. It's not real olive oil. Real olive oil is actually very expensive. So he did some serious damage to the local economy. Burnt up their crops. It's going to have an impact on whether they have something to eat or not. Verse 6, it says, the Philistines said, who has done this? And they answered, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion. And the Philistines came up and burnt her and her father with fire. And let me tell you, one sure way to get burned in life is to get involved in some drama that you didn't have any business in. I mean, goodness, the Bible even tells us to mind our own business. And some of us just can't. We get involved in things that weren't our business, and then we wonder why we're getting burned. The man had no business really giving away the man's wife, even though he didn't do right by his wife. And he brought this down on his house. And then verse 7, Samson said unto them, though you have done this, yet I will be avenged of you. And after that I will cease. And he smote them hip and thigh with great slaughter. And he went down and dwelt in the top of the rock Etam. And the Philistines went up and pitched in Judah, and spread themselves in Lehi. Now there's been consequences and repercussions, like they used to say in the old gangster movies. that there will be consequences and repercussions. And a lot of times we get involved in stuff that we'd had no business being involved in, and next thing you know, there's consequences and repercussions. Things start happening. Because somehow we think because we're under the new covenant of grace that there are not supposed to be consequences, there are not supposed to be any repercussions, there aren't supposed to be, it's supposed to be any ripple effect from anything I do. It's all under the blood. And what you got to understand, Galatians 6 verse 7, be not deceived, God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man sows, that will he also reap. That's New Testament, my friend. And we don't realize that sometimes through our action and our inaction, that the things that we do that we think that we're getting away with, or sometimes we do stuff that we think it's cute or it's funny. And we're mocking God because we think we're going to do something and get away with it. We're going to think we're going to do something and there's going to be no consequences. And then don't get me wrong. I thank God for every time God did not give me the consequences that I deserved. Because I've been in some situations where really I should have been killed. Somebody should have just put a bullet in me for what I did. And some of it wasn't so bad. It's just who I did it to, who I had the nerve to mess with. Stuff you do when you're young, man, and you don't realize, this guy could kill you. And so I'm grateful that God didn't let me get killed. But a lot of times we're in that mode all the time where we act like we throw caution to the wind and do stuff we have no business doing. And we think there's no consequences, and there are. I repeatedly say this to people. You think there's no consequences in the New Testament, you need to read Acts chapter 5. You need to read Acts chapter 13. You need to read the book of Revelation. That's all New Testament. And now it's gotten to the point where it wasn't just a family squabble. It wasn't just, Samson could have settled this with the man who got him mad, who gave away his wife. He could have settled it there. But he decided to take it out on everybody. And we do that in the church. We don't leave our problems at home. Sometimes those of us who are in ministry, who are in leadership, we come into, and I've seen it happen. I've seen pastors go into the church and they're in a bad mood, and instead of delay the service if you got to, get it back in your office and get with God and get that thing right. Don't bring that out in the pulpit, but we do, and it comes out in what they're saying. I've seen preachers throw a temper tantrum because they're mad about something, and it's an ugly thing. We're supposed to walk worthy. Now it's escalated from just being involved with that family to being involved with the people in that town. Now the Philistines have gotten together their army. And they've pitched in Judah. Philistines didn't live in Judah. So they've gone to the trouble of marching an army. This is something that costs. Not just in terms of money and resources. You got to feed those men. They say an army marches on its stomach, and it is true. Now you got X number of men that you got. It says 3,000 men of Judah came. So you got a lot of people involved here. Now, in verse 10, the men of Judah come to Samson and says, "Why are you?" Actually, when they came to the Philistines first, and they said, "Why are you come against us?" And they answered, "To bind Samson we are come up, to do to him as he has done to us." So they're coming for Samson, but they brought their army just in case. And there's a lot of times where we do things spiritually that we end up involving other people that shouldn't have been involved. We do things, especially when we're in leadership. The things we do have repercussions for the people who are under our authority. The things that we do have, if you're a husband, the things you do have repercussions for your wife. If you're a father, it has repercussions for your children. And we don't think, a lot of times we do things and we don't even think of the consequences. And because it doesn't necessarily seem to have any consequences in the natural, we think we're in the clear. And a lot of times there's all kinds of spiritual consequences. A lot of times there's families, oh goodness. I've known preachers who their family is a mess because the preacher wasn't always living right, and he was doing some things, and he seemed to get away with it because nobody in the church knew. I knew a church where they kicked the pastor out, a new pastor took over, and the reason why they were able to get him to leave was because they blackmailed him, because they knew about times he had cheated on his wife. And the church didn't know. They kept it under wraps. But he confided in the wrong person, and they used it against him. And his family was a mess. Kids on drugs. One daughter, I think, died of AIDS because she was a mess. She was a prolific fornicator, let's put it politely. Other son was a drug dealer. Son's in and out of prison. You're the pastor of the church. It should not be. So even though the people didn't know he was slipping and dipping here and there, maybe he really repented, maybe he was sorry, but he didn't get that right. And because he operated in deception to cover it up, he left his family open to spiritual attack. He left them open to demonic suggestion. And a lot of times that's the actual cause of a lot of problems people have in their household, where they're having demonic attacks, where there's issues of demonic affliction or even possession among their family members, and it's because somebody has been doing something they got no business doing, and they let that thing in. In this case, Samson has brought a whole army up against them because he couldn't resolve something with the people he had a conflict with. Now we can say, well, God was in all this. Yeah, God had to use this because, again, Samson wasn't going to do anything unless somebody provoked him, unless something bad happened that basically ticked Samson off. He wasn't going to do anything. And my goodness, we shouldn't be like this. So after this, it says in verse 11, then 3,000 men of Judah went up to the top of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, don't you know the Philistines are rulers over us? What is this you have done to us? And he said to them, as they did to me, so have I done to them. And a lot of times we do things in a situation where it's almost like you got to ask the question, don't you know the situation? Didn't you know the situation you were in? That you had no business doing this? This was a fight you didn't need to start? It's like the old saying, don't start nothing, there won't be nothing. And a lot of times, a lot of the warfare that we've got is warfare we brought on ourselves. You know, we act like the devil's just acting up. Oh, the devil's fighting my call. It wasn't just the devil fighting your call. You did something stupid and you brought it on yourself. And I'm not saying that by way of condemnation. I'm saying that by way of experience. I've been there. Again and again. So many times I'm ashamed to say it. Because I knew better. Had all kinds of spiritual conflicts I had to deal with, waking up in the middle of the night and having to rebuke demons because I wasn't praying, because I wasn't fasting. Or because I said something I shouldn't have said. Did something I shouldn't have did. And I know we preachers, we like to act like we've been perfect, and we want to act all, you know, super mega holy and all that, like we've never made a mistake or whatever. Because if we don't do that, we got this whole image thing because people are obsessed with image. And that is the reason why they almost never recognize substance. But I digress. And Samson, you know, Samson's not even apologetic for any of this. It's just, well, as they did it to me, they didn't do that to him. They disrespected him. They didn't burn down his crops. They didn't ruin his harvest. They didn't do lasting economic harm to him. They just hurt his pride. And not like he cared about this woman a whole lot anyway. I mean, he apparently hadn't been to see her in a couple of months. And a lot of times we're like that, where we get all offended and on our high horse and we are ready to fight over something we didn't really care about in the first place. It's just, you know, now that you offended my pride, I got to make an issue out of it. And we make issues out of things, you know, It's almost like kids in a schoolyard dealing with people in the church, where you got everybody's huffing and puffing and stressing and so mad. And it's like there's a video that went viral on YouTube where this teacher got between these two students, told them both sit down unless they wanted to fight him. It's like, there's nothing you got going on in 8th grade that is so serious that you can't squash it. And in the light of eternity, there usually isn't a whole lot we got going on in terms of personal conflict with our brethren that we can't squash, that we can't resolve somehow. Now, don't get me wrong, sometimes there's legitimate conflict, but a lot of stuff is just petty stuff that we just choose to get offended over. Because a lot of us use offense as a means of control. But I digress again. So we also see a lack of maturity on the part of Samson. Samson's basically like, I did what they did to me, and it wasn't the truth. So we see that Samson's got some character issues. And those are the underlying character issues, why he behaves this way and why he has these women problems that he has in the first place. Because the woman problem isn't really his problem. The underlying problem is that Samson's irresponsible. Samson doesn't really have a whole lot of self-control. That's why he's got to go after, he's basically, every time he sees a pretty foreign woman, he's got to have her. Now let me tell you, the New Testament priesthood, it's a walk of discipline. Paul said, I beat my body under. I heard one preacher say years ago, the flesh is a monster, and yes, it is. I mean, goodness, years ago when I was younger, oh man, I did so much fasting, and it wasn't because I was so holy, it was because I was so desperate, because I was struggling, because I had problems with fornication. So I just decided to fast and fast and fast. And I'd heard one preacher say that God did some amazing things in his life because he would eat during the week and fast on the weekend. So I said to myself, well, I wonder what will happen if I fast during the week and eat on the weekends. And I started doing that. Sometimes for a couple months at a time, I'd eat one meal a week. I got real skinny. It was like 120 pounds, sometimes less than 120 pounds. These days, I'm probably about 165, 170. But I overcame. And a lot of times, we're not willing to do what we got to do to keep our life clean. I used to go shut in the church, and the deacon would drop me off, and I didn't have keys for the church at that time. Later on, I did when I became an elder. And he was going to hand me the keys, and I said, no, keep the keys. I said, lock me in and put the padlock on. I'm the prisoner of Christ tonight. And he laughed. He started laughing. I said, I'm serious. Put the padlock on. I'm on a fast. I don't want to cheat. I don't want to go downstairs and go buy something to eat at the little restaurant that's around the corner. I don't want to do that. And he locked me in the church. Looking back on it, may not have been the wisest thing, because if the building had caught on fire, it'd basically be behind a steel door. 120-pound guy's probably not going to be able to kick his way through that. But be that as it may, the point of the story was I was willing to do whatever I had to do to keep my life clean. And you may have noticed this, but God usually does not exercise discipline for you. That's your decision. Discipline is one of the fruit of the Spirit. Doesn't mean the Spirit makes you do it. It is the fruit. It is the byproduct. It is what comes out when you are yielded to the Spirit. And then that's another issue entirely. We don't yield to the Holy Spirit. We're doing our own thing, and then we wonder why we can't exercise discipline in a godly way. And so they say to him in verse 12, and they said unto him, we are come down to bind you, that we may deliver you into the hand of the Philistines. And Samson said unto them, swear unto me that you will not fall upon me yourselves. And let me tell you, something you got to understand about conflict, and something you got to understand about dealing with people, saved or unsaved, is that when the chips are down, if you have done something that brings trouble on a group of people, most likely they are going to sell you out. That's just, it is what it is. It's human nature. And in some cases, they're right to do so. In this case, they were right to do so. People say that, Brother Sam, that's messed up. It's messed up that Samson brought this trouble on them in the first place. And the reality is, people will sell you out. And so, a lot of times, we have this regrettable tendency where we do stuff and we're surprised that somebody sold us out to other people. And I'm rebooting. I also broadcast live on Pal Talk, so I'm rebooting Pal Talk because sometimes it messes up, and hopefully we have sound again in there. But I'm recording, so I can't stop. And we're gonna continue here with verse 13. He says, "And they spoke to him, saying, No, but we will bind you fast and deliver you into their hand. But surely we will not kill you. And they bound him with 2 new cords and brought him up from the rock. And when he came unto Lehi, the Philistines shouted against him. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the cords that were on his arms became as flax that was burned with fire, and the bands loosed from off his hands." Now, some people say that this is an illustration of just how strong he was, that he broke it like they were burned with fire. Other people say that they burned up and fell off him. Either way, it's pretty impressive. And the point is, Samson is about to throw down. And verse 15, he doesn't even have a weapon because he's been tied up, right? It says he found a new jawbone of an ass and put forth his hand and took it and slew 1,000 men with it. You're a pretty bad dude. You can take a jawbone. Now, the jawbone is a really hard bone. It's one of the hardest bones in the human body, and in a donkey, it's probably a pretty hard bone, especially since they use their jaw a lot more than we do. Our main use for our jaw is talking. We don't chew as much as a donkey does because they eat grass and hay and things like that, and they got to chew and chew and chew, and they spend like half their day eating. So that jaw is going to be tough. That jaw is strong. Makes a pretty decent weapon. It's not a great weapon, but you are a bad dude if you can pick up a jaw and kill 1,000 men with it. And so everybody's impressed by that. But I look at this and I said, what could have Samson have done if he hadn't been so irresponsible, if he hadn't wasted his time with these foolish women, if he hadn't gone doing things he wasn't supposed to do? What kind of deliverer would Samson have been had he taken that same strength, picked up a sword and the proper equipment, and led a bunch of men, and he could have set Israel free? Everybody likes to focus on how impressive Samson was. And I wasn't impressed when I was younger, but as I look at this, I see it this way now because I look at myself and I see the gifts God gave me, and I see the times that I could have used them better, and that I could have been a better steward of the call of God in my life, and I wasn't. All the different times that I wasted my time and really wasted His time. And so I see a bit of myself in Samson here. I don't think I've been quite this bad, but be that as it may. And looks like some of the people in the room may not have good sound. If you are having trouble with sound, re-log in, and sometimes the sound improves. And so he does this, and he says, it says, and Samson said, with the jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps, with the jaw of an ass, I have slain 1,000 men. And it came to pass, when he made an end of speaking, that he cast away the jawbone out of his hand and called that place Ramath Lehi. Samson is also careless. He just throws it away. He just uses to kill 1,000 men. He just throws it away. Samson has a lot of disregard for a lot of things. And very often we are just as careless with the things of God. We are just as careless sometimes even with the instrument of our very deliverance. Sometimes it wasn't the jawbone of an ass, but sometimes it was a person who was the instrument of our deliverance. And we are not careful in how we treat those people. And I've seen it happen. I've seen people, they treat someone bad. This person becomes a deliverer to them. And as soon as they get what they want, they go back to treating that person exactly the way they treated them before. The saints had nerve, man. I'd be a little scared to do that myself. But again, it comes back to the fact that people don't have the fear of God anymore. And it says, and he was sore athirst, and called upon the Lord, and said, you've given this great deliverance into the hand of your servant, and now I shall die for thirst, and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised. Verse 19, but God clave a hollow place that was in the jaw, and there came water thereout. And when he had drunk, his spirit came again, and he revived. Therefore he called the name thereof En-hakkore, which is in Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. And next week we're going to get into the following chapter where we get to talk about Delilah and that all that drama. But I want to point out something here, that a lot of times there's an instrument of deliverance in our life, and we kind of set it aside or cast it aside, and we kind of disregard it, and we don't even realize God is intending to use it again. And it's like I've said to people, I've said this to my wife on a number of occasions, I said I don't throw people away. I'm not quick to throw somebody away, because I never know if God's going to turn this person around. It doesn't mean that we got to stay in a relationship with people who are just not right. That's not what I'm referring to. But a lot of times we throw people away over minor, insignificant things that don't matter. Or we're just careless with what God put in our hands. Great deliverance worked, and we just set it aside like it was nothing. And I've seen it happen where great deliverance happens because the people were fasting, the people were praying, they're crying out to God. They get the deliverance, the victory happens, and then they just go about their business, and they go back to either completely or largely neglecting their life of worship and prayer. And this ought not to be. And don't get me wrong, God won't have you constantly on a fast, because you'll die. But there is supposed to be a life of prayer. There is supposed to be a life of dedication. And my challenge to you tonight is to examine the ways in which you may have been careless. Examine the ways in which you may have been irresponsible with the things of God. Ask yourself, what kind of steward have I been over the gift and calling of God on my life? Have I maximized it? Have I really explored its possibilities? And I'm not saying that you need to launch out and do things without God leading you. What I am saying is this: if you're called to preach, maybe there's nowhere for you to preach right now, but prepare some sermons. I said this to someone years ago because they didn't have anywhere to preach. Start preparing sermons. Prepare as many as you can. Get ready. If you really believe the vision that God gave you, then prepare as though you believe it. Prepare as though you know it's going to happen. Don't be like Samson, willy-nilly, things happen because God has to force his hand. If you're called to preach, prepare sermons. If you're called as a prophet, well, get in fasting, get in prayer, get in the face of God. It's impossible to pray too much. Most of us pray too little. You believe you're called as a worship leader? Spend time in worship. Because if you don't, Instead of a worship leader, you're going to be an entertainer, and that's what's happened in most of the churches today. Where worship leaders are more entertainers than they are, they don't really lead you into worship, they entertain you. And a lot of times it's very plain to see that they don't have a life of worship, they don't have a life of prayer. They are not really consecrated to God. Whatever it is you believe God has called you to do, prepare for it. Prepare as though you believe and no one can tell you otherwise that this is what God has called you to do, and start preparing for it. That same person I told that years ago, I said to her, I'm not preaching anywhere right now. I've got like 30 sermons just on the subject of deliverance. I'm preparing, and I'm preparing abundantly. David did not even get to build the temple, but he prepared abundantly before he died. And that's a whole other issue that maybe we should touch on a little bit, that we don't even think of legacy because we're selfish, because we're wondering, we're just thinking about the great ministry we're going to have and whatever prominence we might come to, or whatever. And we don't even think about the future. We don't even think about who's supposed to carry this after me. Who is this supposed to impact? Whose life is going to be changed? Who's going to read this book and become the man he was intended to be, or become the woman she was intended to be, because they read this book and it inspired them and it moved them and they realized the call of God on their life? Most of the time we don't think that way. Prepare abundantly. Because let me tell you, Samson was a useful idiot. We see all manner of evidence here of how irresponsible he was. Man didn't take care of his wife. Cops an attitude when they gave her away to somebody else. Brother, you didn't want her. And a lot of times we do the same thing with the ministry God has given to us. We're careless, we're sloppy. And my goodness, in the Old Testament, you couldn't get away with that. You got sloppy in the temple, you might die. And if you were going behind the veil, you better not be sloppy, because God would definitely kill you. And we're saying, well, Brother Sam, God isn't killing people right now. Wouldn't say that. I can think of a few people God definitely killed here in the New Testament era, and even recently. There was one preacher who started saying we need to stop talking about Jesus and stop talking about the blood so much. That we need just talk about kingdom principles and not mention Jesus at all. He died not long after that, and I don't care what anybody says. You don't gotta like me. That was the judgment of God. God took him out. Because it is the gospel of the kingdom. You can't preach the gospel of the kingdom and never mention its king. Because if somebody came to you telling you about a fabulous kingdom, and they start telling you where it is, and they start telling you all about the kingdom, sooner or later, even just out of curiosity, you're going to want to know who the king is. Everywhere, every kingdom that's ever existed, when they went to conquer another land, they always did so in the name of the king. And somebody wants to preach the gospel without its king? We had to preach Christ and Him crucified. So prepare abundantly. Don't take the calling of God on your life lightly. Don't be careless. It's time to take some responsibility. Exercise some discipline. Because I don't know about you, I want to be useful, and I'd really like not to be an idiot anymore. I'm Sam Medina. God bless you, and God keep you.